Let's talk Kinsmen, Judgment, and AI augmented space dwarves, with a discussion of starting leagues of Votann in Warhammer 40K from a standing start. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where I thought it was high time that we made a proper start collecting video for 40k's newest faction, and that's exactly what we're going to do here. We'll talk about why you might want to start collecting a Leagues of Votann army, a discussion of planning an army and research getting the miniatures together, some ideas for the first models and units you might want to pick up for your new Space Dwarf army, a quick look at their recent discount box sets, and some ideas for expanding the army beyond that and getting towards a 2000 points Leagues of Votann list. Loads to talk about, so let's talk about the prospects that the king can bring to the table. So first up, why would you want to collect a Leagues of Votann army in Warhammer 40k in general? Lore-wise, they're kind of interesting, being the newest big faction on the scene. Leagues of Votann are basically the reincarnation of the ancient space dwarf squats that Games Workshop removed from the game well over 20 years ago. This new race shares a fair few similarities with them, but have kind of gone their own way. They're descended from ancient human mining colonists that set off for the galactic core in humanity's distant past, but have diverged significantly from humanity since then, at some point in their murky past, having their entire society restructured around enormous logic engines called the Votann. These ancestor cores basically running every aspect of kin society. The kin themselves are cloned and specialised to their individual tasks, and fight together in great leagues, usually making war to gain or obtain resources, or repel the various galactic horrors of the 41st millennium. When they make war, as you might expect from dwarves in space, they have the very finest artisanally crafted weapons available, often making use of heavily upgraded versions of Imperial technology and some more exotic weapons like ion or rail weapons. Their armour is particularly hardy void armour, and they've got multiple exotic close combat weapons such as powerful plasma blades and concussion gauntlets. Miniatures wise, the leagues are a recently released miniature range, 4 infantry kits, 3 kits for bikes or vehicles, and 4 characters. Not really a bad selection for a faction that's newly launched to Warhammer 40k. They do at least have a couple of choices to fill most of the Force organisation slots, though of course currently they are more limited than the vast majority of other factions. In general, I describe their models as kind of generic sci-fi, spacesuits and rounded helmets, and maybe just a few nods to dwarven ancestry, things like totem crests and inlaid runic armour. Here's a few miniature selections from their current range. They've got the Hearthkin Warriors on the top left there. Quite small and short miniatures, as you might expect for essentially space dwarfs. I think they're perhaps some of the nicest looking models in their range. Otherwise, we've got a mighty land fortress on the top right. Generally, their vehicles seem to be big and chunky with big wheels and some perspex canopies, maybe looking a little bit like moon buggies perhaps. On the bottom left, we've got an Ironhair Hearthguard, kind of like a Votann equivalent of a Terminator with exo armor, a Hernkin Pioneer with a great big rotary cannon manned by the Kinsman on the back, an interesting sort of grav trike design there, and on the right we've got a Brockier Forge Master, essentially a Votann engineer or tech marine with a graviton rifle and hammer. Generally a fairly snazzy range overall, lots of detail on the kits as they're recent Games Workshop plastics. Price-wise, I'd say that Leagues of Votann, despite being a newish range, are actually really not too bad as 40k kits go. Compared with at least a fair chunk of other armies, most of their box sets do tend to give you at least a fair amount of points on the table. That's partly due to the big points increases that they got after their codex came out, but it does have the helpful knock-on effect that you don't need quite as many of them to make up a 2000 point army anymore, and they're perhaps just a little bit more economical than I might have expected for a new Games Workshop faction. Certainly not as outstanding as Space Marines with their multiple discount options, but not too bad. Gameplay-wise, their current rules are found in Codex Leagues of Votann, and generally I describe their playstyle as an army that just really wants to rely on massive amounts of damage, often at fairly close range. Their judgment token mechanic is maybe the biggest focus of the codex. The dwarves get angrier and angrier at certain units as the battle goes on, either helped out by their carls or when their units kill yours. When you get to be judgment tokens, you get to auto wound them on a 4+ to hit, which is just massively powerful against tough targets. And when you stack a few of those judgment tokens on a unit, they're very easy to kill. They augment that with great stratagems as well, and pretty reasonable close range weapon profiles. Compared with other 40k factions, I'd say they're a little bit more close range and slow than a bunch of them, but it's not like they don't have options to mitigate that, say they're fast bikers or teleporting Hearthguards. Currently in game, it looks like they're still remaining very strong, and that's despite the pretty enormous points nerf that they got following the update of their codex. Definitely a challenge for several armies to fight, particularly things that rely on being big and tough and solid, like say Adeptus Custodes or Imperial Knights. Overall, I'd say they're a pretty cool new faction, doubtly AI augmented space dwarves who play a bit differently in game and can bring some enormous damage. If you do want to play Leagues of Votann, then let's talk about planning an army. First up, there's plenty of resources that you can use to find out a bit more about them. Picking up Codex Leagues of Votann wouldn't be the worst move in the world. It does have all their data sheets, even if you need to update the points values, plus some miniature galleries and lore. Otherwise, for messing around with rules, you can use things like Battlescribe, Warhapedia, or Games Workshop's app for rules and army list crafting. Can give you a bit more of an idea as to what sort of force you might wind up playing with, and you potentially can do a little bit of trying before you buy, maybe proxy some models in-game with other miniatures you might own, or play them on Tabletop Simulator. YouTube's a pretty awesome resource as well. I've made a fair few Leagues of Votann focus videos recently. Perhaps some of the most useful ones might be the whole army rules review that had dropped a week or so back. I've also done a guide to strengths and weaknesses of each one of their units, plus a guide to each one of the leagues. I'll link those videos down in the description. Otherwise though, elsewhere on YouTube there's battle reports to see them in action, painting guides to help out with the hobby side of things, and plenty of lore in abundance from people covering the new fluff. For a bit more of a well-rounded take from other hobbyists as well, it's probably worth investigating social media avenues too. The Leagues of Votann have Discord servers, subreddits, and a Facebook page. Can just be a bit of a window into what other hobbyists are doing with them, and a good place to ask any basic questions to current collectors. Otherwise though, when you've got a bit more of a handle on the faction in general, I'd try and get an idea of what sort of army you want specifically, both in terms of what sort of miniatures that you want in it, and also what sort of paint scheme. When building an army, you certainly could pick one of the specific leagues from the lore. They've got 5 main ones, and I have made that video comparing them. Things like the hardy Urani Surta Regulates, the vicious Cronus Melee Army, or Ymir with all their technological innovations. They've got their own colour schemes, though you could certainly just make up one of your own and then use the rules that best fit your lore or playstyle. In terms of different ways to play the Leagues of Votann, I do feel that different avenues are quite viable at the moment. I think most lists will want a good amount of characters, some Hearthkin for the battalions, and some bikes for objectives, but beyond that you could expand on a few different themes, maybe focusing on more vicious melee infantry like the Chthonian Berserks and the Einhir Hearthguard. Go nice and vehicle heavy with some Sagittars or Land Fortresses, or maybe play a bit of a Votann Horde army with a whole bunch of Hearthkin. I think fairly early on, I'd maybe think about drafting an initial 500 point list for something you might want to field in a combat patrol game, and maybe think about what sort of units you'd add building up to a 2000 point list, just for a rough idea and something that you can make adjustments to as you go on and get more experience. On the hobbying side of things, I'd start by painting up a test model or two. Likely some standard Hearthkin warriors are a pretty reasonable way to start. They've got most of the elements that are visible on the other models in the army. I'll probably start by taking a look at a few other YouTube tutorials to see how people go about painting theirs, and then maybe either copy one exactly, or make your own colour scheme and adapt other people's styles to how you want to have your army look in the end. With all that planning done, let's talk about some ideas for first purchases for the army, and as mentioned already, I will be tempted to pick up the Codex at least fairly early on. It's £32.50, $55, or €42.50, and it is the main book that you generally need to play the army. As mentioned, Games Workshop does make changes to points and rules occasionally. When the book of this first came out, it was just monumentally strong compared with the other 40k factions, so Games Workshop has got a download of the new Votann points available to try and make them a bit more in line with the other factions. They've also got an FAQ document over on Warhammer Community which answered a few questions, particularly around beam weapons. It also made one important change to the rule, meaning that judgment tokens never count as an auto wound of a 6 again, which was the source of some of the most broken combos in the codex, mostly stuff that was kind of ridiculously strong, though it does put the book in a bit of a weird place where sometimes the judgment tokens can get in the way of other fun mechanics. At this point I would also bear in mind that the book might have a limited shelf life. We don't know 100% what Games Workshop's going to do with 10th edition, though it's certainly not impossible that they might release completely new rules, every faction just going back to a more basic index version of itself like 8th edition. If that's true, 10th edition is rumoured for sometime in 2023, probably summer to autumn I'd guess, so I would bear in mind that the book could have a limited shelf life, and it might be one to consider reselling early, if and when Games Workshop announces if that's happening. Perhaps just something to be aware of with Games Workshop regularly updating their paper rulebooks. Otherwise, and perhaps the more fun bit, are the first models to pick up. I think I'll be tempted to start out with one of the discount boxes, Combat Patrol Leagues of Votann, or potentially the Leagues of Votann launch box, if you can still find that at a reasonable price. We'll talk about both of those in a second, but otherwise, if you just wanted to dip your toe into the faction, probably a box of Hearthkin Warriors is as good a place to start as any. If you were going to get a single HQ choice on its own, then maybe a Carl would be alright. I feel like he's a model that most lists tend to use just about every game and is the core choice for the faction, the equivalent of something like a Space Marine Captain perhaps, though I certainly wouldn't be dissuaded from anything else that's just particularly inspiring to you. If you want to get a great big land fortress with a massive railgun, might be a bit of a weird place to start, but you certainly can if you fancy. When buying 40k miniatures, I generally keep a few things in mind. You certainly can buy directly from Games Workshop, and it's perhaps the most reliable way to get things, but also usually the most expensive. If you wanted some alternate models for basically dwarves in space as well, you could think about looking at the Necromunda Squats type range as well. They've got a few things that would fit in fairly well, and you could do some conversions to make the war gear right. Otherwise, though, for cheaper miniatures, then often places like local gaming stores could be pretty reasonable. In a whole lot of countries, Games Workshop have third-party stockists that stock their new range at around about a 10 or 20% discount, so it's basically buying the same thing but cheaper. In the UK, Element Games is an example of that. Feel free to check out the link in the video description. That one's an affiliate link that also supports Auspex Tactics as well, and it doesn't cost you any more if you buy it after clicking it. Typically, when I pick up 40k models, I generally try and do that through that, as it can save you a lot of money in the long run. Otherwise, eBay in the second-hand market is certainly worth a look. Leagues of Votann won't have as many pre-owned models, though a few people might have already got bored of their starter sets, I suppose. But in particular, at least in the short term, a lot of bits that came in that launch box are going a bit cheaper, in particular the Leagues of Votann limited edition codex, due to a lot of people buying multiple copies of the launch box to get the models early, and then selling off the books. Could also be worth a look for Hearthkin and characters like the Carl as well, they should be going cheaper than normal. Otherwise, 3D printing is a very real competitor to Games Workshop's models these days. Lots of individuals make similar alternative sculpts that can kind of represent the models in game. Can be fun for some aesthetic upgrades as well. And third parties do sculpt their own miniatures as well. Various other companies make dwarves in space type models that could also serve as alternatives. If you do want to go with the full fat Games Workshop plastic kits though, then Combat Patrol Leagues of Votann I think is a pretty reasonable place to start. This one's £90, €120 or $150, of course a little bit cheaper if you go somewhere like one of the independent stores like Element Games. In this one you get a Carl, 10 Hearthkin Warriors, 3 Hernkin Pioneers and 5 Chthonian Berserks. Overall I'd rate this as really quite a decent set of units to start the faction with, to be honest. The vast majority of them are very useful. The Car's the main model that can hand out judgment tokens. You can also build them as Uthar the Destined if you're playing Great Etherean League. The Hearthkin Warriors are the generic troops choice, so are just kind of necessary for filling any normal detachments. The Hernkin Pioneers are perhaps some of the strongest models in the Codex, fast moving bikes with Obsec, and can get line of sight with their scary guns. And the Chthonian Berserks might be fairly slow melee troops, but they do have perhaps some of the biggest damage output in the whole Codex with their plasma axes or concussion balls, though you might be tempted to pick up a Sagittor to get them from A to B. Money-wise, if you chose to buy these exact models separately, they'd come to around $213, so you save around about $63 or about a 29% discount. Fairly reasonable savings, maybe a little bit lower than some of the other Combat Patrol boxes out there. It does stack up to a pretty reasonable points per dollar ratio though. You get around about 510 points worth of models depending on exactly what gear that you give them, and that's not really too bad by Games Workshop's 40k standards. In general, I feel like it could be a pretty solid first pickup, and I think if I was starting Leagues of Votann from a standing start, I'd probably wind up getting 2 of those at some point down the line. The bikes Hearthkin and Berserks are all definitely units that you could run in multiples. Maybe the car might be a bit more questionable, but people still seem to run multiple versions in the same list. Otherwise, for discount boxes, the other option is the Votann launch box. This one's now out of production from Games Workshop, but they did make quite a lot of them, and you'll still see a fair amount of these going either on eBay or in third-party sellers. The price of this one was £120, €155 or $200. It's got some overlap with the Combat Patrol box, but not entirely. You get 2 units of the Hearthkin, the car, 3 Hernkin, and the Ironhair Champion this time, the melee beatdown character for the Votann with his big hammer. You also get the codex and the data cards as well, plus some other bits like some transfers and the judgment tokens. If you're just getting into the faction, it looks like a really pretty reasonable pickup as well. And between this and one of the Combat Patrol box sets, you could have a pretty solid core of a Votann army, enough Hearthkin warriors to fill a detachment, plus multiple units of the Great Hernkin. The discount adds up to around about 40% off what you buy the things for separately, presuming you did want all of it, including the data cards. And as I mentioned, a fair few people are reselling various bits of this online. It could worth be checking out eBay if you want to pick up some Hearthkin or a Carl. Once you've picked up some models, here are just some ideas for building some of the first kits in the combat patrol. There are various different viable ways that you can build all the units, but here's just my very rough take if you're interested. For the Carl, I think I'll be tempted to equip him with the Plasma Axe. That way you can use it as the Flare relic, which gives him extra attacks and turns him into a pretty credible combat threat. Both of the guns seem usable. I slightly prefer the Autok Stormbolter. For the standard Hearthkin warriors, I'd perhaps be most tempted by the bolters. They seem to synergize really nicely with the judgment tokens, lots of volume fire that gets auto wounds. The ion blasters are still fine though, perhaps particularly in Ymir where they get a bit more range, and otherwise I'd pretty much always take the medic as a very cheap survivability boost, plus allows you a good stratagem. The scanner's okay for some ignores cover, and out of the guns I'd be most tempted by the rail rifle for a big shot of ignores invul's anti-tank goodness. For those Hernkin pioneers, I'd say that the searchlight is really good value. That allows you an easy stratagem to put another judgment token on a key unit, plus the rotary cannon just seems amazing value for 10 points with all the extra spam shots that you get from it. Otherwise, the two different types of scanners, ignoring cover and dense cover, both of those seem fine as well. These bites really are quite good at just laser focusing fire on something with a bunch of judgment tokens, as they've got the movement to get them in range. Finally, from the combat patrol box, if you're picking up the berserks, I'd say that both the plasma axes and the concussion maws are pretty usable. Out of the two, I perhaps do slightly prefer the maws over the blades, though if you've got a bunch of judgment tokens on the target that you're about to hit, then the blades do catch up by quite a bit, their low strength not mattering as much. The mole grenade I think is a bit take or leave. It does allow you a very nice fights last stratagem, but a fair few people do like to keep the squad just a bit more focused and not doing anything besides melee. From there, after picking up the Combat Patrol box set, I'd be wanting to try and get that together and get in a few small games against people on the table, and then just gradually expand the army unit by unit, picking up things that you particularly like the lore or models for, or you think is going to give the army some more threat in game. I'd say currently in the Leagues of Votann Codex, Games Workshop have perhaps done very well to make just about every unit really quite interesting to take in competitive lists. I guess with quite a small roster, they don't have too much competition for their roles. Out of any of them, I feel like the Brockier Thunderkin are maybe the ones that got left behind a bit, are slow and slightly static fire support units that just doesn't really gain all that much over the rest. I'd argue currently the weakest unit in the book, but if you want to run them, then even these aren't unusably bad. You could certainly make a unit of them work if you wanted. Generally, going through the roster, Hearthkin are good to have in abundance. I'd at least want enough to have 3 squads to fill a battalion, and some people like to build out bigger squads up to 20 and give them some big buffs like the toughness buff from a Grimnir. The Hernkin, as mentioned, I feel are basically auto-include for Votann at the moment. Fast moving obsec bikes with good firepower, not super durable, but they've got to have some trade-offs, they're just really good. Generally, I'd want to field units of Berserks in Sagittars for them to get where they need to go, and then acts as a bit of a battlefield bunker for the Berserks to charge out and break things. I know Hearthguard are pretty pricey, but still seem to be cheap enough to warrant inclusion. The thing I like most about them is their Vulcanite blasters with immortal wounds on 6s. They combo really effectively with a high Carl's rerolls, and I like their teleport shunts to jump them forward into a scary position. The mighty land fortress is big, tough and dangerous. They particularly excel with a nearby Brockier Forge Master, negating damage and big repairs on them, and you can still get some pretty cheesy things out of the Railgun in Great Etherean League if you've got Uthar the Destined plugging in an auto 6 to wound and guaranteeing you the big splash damage. Finally, literally all of the Leagues of Votann characters are pretty awesome value for the points cost that they bring. The Carl does your judgment tokens, the Grimnir can farm command points and make a unit tough, the Iron Hair Champion is hilarious melee damage with that Exactor relic, and the Iron Master is the support that you want for land fortresses and can also do some things like mess around with war gear stratagems. Lots of different ways that you can go. You can build a more balanced Votann list or go a bit mad and go down one theme. Finally, just to finish up, I thought we'd just take a quick look at one idea for a competitive Votann list. This one was one that won a tournament and we featured on the channel a little while back. This one's a Chronos Hegemony list, so the big melee Votann, and it was run by Marshall Peterson, who used it to take first at PCG Lightly Salted 4GT. The list is in a single Chronos Hegemony battalion, and perhaps the biggest focus of the list are 3 scary units of Chthonian Berserks, 2 with axes and 1 with mauls. They all take mole grenades, and 2 of them look like they'll be able to load up into Sagittars with some autocannons. Besides that, there's 3 minimum sized units of Hearthkin warriors to fill out the battalions, all with bolters, and 1 takes some upgrades like the Magna Rail and the Medpack. There's then a unit of 5 Einhir Hearthguard who take the Vulcanite shots and the gauntlets. They've got the Weaver Hill crest for extra toughness, so aren't teleporting there. And there's 3 units of Hernkin Pioneers. They have the High-Las rotary cannons and the scanners. Finally, the list is headed up by Brockier Forge Master with a long list a warlord trait that allows you to bounce judgment tokens around from slain units to other ones, an enormously scary melee Iron Here champion with that Exactor relic that gives mortal wounds on 6s, plus the Cronus warlord trait for exemplary hero that allows you to re-roll the hit rolls and perhaps fish for those 6s if you want to. Finally, there's a High Carl who grants some re-rolls to a unit. He's got the Flare Axe and is Warrior Lord and has a Rampart Crest and Vulcanite gun. Perhaps a bit more of a skewed list towards close combat, with it being Cronus after all, but certainly showcases one way that you can play Votann pretty competitively. Perhaps armies like Immic Conglomerate or Great Etherean League might be a bit better if you want to go a bit more well-rounded. The Berserks are still strong enough to field in those, I think. So anyway, I think we'll leave that there for a bit of a guide into getting into Leagues of Votann in Warhammer 40k. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below, and any other insights from Votann collectors are greatly appreciated. Please let me know anything else that might help out new players. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'm sure we'll have more to come for the Leagues of Votann at some stage, though I will link a few of my videos down in the video description, including my Which League to Play video, comparing your things like your Urani Certa Regulates and your Immic Conglomerates. Might be useful for a bit more discussion around them. Otherwise, if you found the video useful, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics has a Patreon page, and that's how I can keep on making videos like this quite so regularly, with new content out for 40k just about every day. All the content does take an enormous amount of time and effort to make, so if you are enjoying quite a bit, any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an enormous thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.